So following up to part one on harp trees, this is a shorter segment, just capturing extra data that I wanted to include in part one, but that video was just too big. I have a few other case studies that I found on the traps as I've been traveling around the southwest. As acknowledged, most of the footage I got on the highway running from Nannup to Bridgetown, but there were a couple of other interesting trees, one of which, the really significant one, is actually of a limb which is swept to the ground and rooted, and is a really good example of the adaptation that gum trees can make when in close contact to ground. So without further ado, let's jump into session 2. In support of my Treecast on harp trees, this tree is an important find. This is the Tuart Gum tree, or Eucalyptus gomphocephala. This study involves 2 field pasture trees growing side by side. One of the trees in which has got a low limb which has swept down to the ground and is a really good example of a limb which has rooted to the soil. This is an essential characteristic of how gum trees, any tree, can adapt from being a fallen tree to a standing tree. The ability to grow roots into the ground is an essential trait for fallen trees which transition into being harp trees, or trees which reiterate and reorientate. In horticulture, plants which can do this are known as plants which layer. They layer their bodies, and in doing so propagate themselves vegetatively into the soil. Many grass plants do this. This is similar to grafting. A stem will rub up against the stem and cause the outer bark to be rubbed off, and then the tissues coalesce and form a graft. It's the same with a branch that sweeps to the ground, is abraded on the surface of the ground, and then the tissues form roots and root into the ground. Here we have classic evidence of a limb that has swept to the ground, formed a rooting point. That rooting point has swollen, tissues have been laid down thickening it, so you can see it has a fairly large footprint. The main stem has also thickened substantially at that rooting point. And then travelling further up the limb, we come to another rooting point, smaller, but we can see the same body language. And just above that is a leader which has transitioned from a shoot into a well-thickened branch. You can see how further along on that limb, the diameter is much smaller. That is because the tree has put energy into that rooting point and that leader, and so it hasn't thickened. Yeah, and more evidence tracking up right at the very top of the limb. We look at these epicormic shoots. Almost certain, I would say, that coinciding with those shooting points on the underside, there'll be rooting points as well. I can tell just by kicking that this is really anchored to the ground. Yeah, here's more evidence. Look at the diameter of this limb at the point that it's connecting to the ground, and then tracking up the branch, looking at the fairly narrow diameter of the limb itself, which is still functioning, still alive, still growing, still shooting on the ends, you can see. But coming back up the limb, we can see the diameter is quite a bit smaller. So I would say at this point here, a major root has been grown into the ground, hence the thickening that's still going on here. The limb hasn't needed to thicken tracking up the branch. On my ride-bys, whilst gathering data inputs, I found a couple more trees, and these are an interesting study as they're not an overly resilient species, but still they're doing a good job to adapt following failure. This adaptation involves reorientation as opposed to reiteration. These studies involve shear failure at the root crown as opposed to root ball failure, though close study involves evidence of rooting at the base of the failure. I have yet to identify this plant. It looks like it could be an exotic, possibly planted as street trees. It is likely that these short-lived pioneer species were felled by the same wind event. This second failure is most certainly a shear failure. It doesn't look like there was any movement at the root crown, but most certainly there has been root regeneration in support of this adaptation. Likewise, this tree has reorientated since falling. So in closing on the subject of harp trees, this is a topic I will be coming back to as I get more footage, but as I prepare myself for delivery. You know, as acknowledged, I am intending to run workshops on how we can actually accelerate the process to enable trees to stand up. But I encourage, you know, that those of you who are really passionate about learning more on this to, you know, have a look at the description that goes with these videos. You'll see links to articles that I've written on the topic. You know, I'm always writing, so there's always more that I'll be adding in. But thank you, and all the best to you.